The blood trail started at the entrance and didn't stop until it reached the trauma bay. 4 armed men walked through the sliding glass doors of Ridgeline General Hospital like they owned every inch of it. Guns visible, faces covered, moving with the kind of calm that meant they'd done this before. Every doctor in that ER went still. Every seasoned physician, every senior resident, every attending with a decade of trauma experience, they all froze. All except one. A 30-year-old nurse who everyone in that hospital had spent the last 11 months telling she didn't belong there stood up from behind the triage desk, looked at the 4 armed men, and started quietly counting exits. Her name was Nora Voss, and she was about to become the most important person in the room. If this story already has your pulse running, follow along, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Ridgeline General Hospital sat on the eastern edge of Callaway, Montana, a mid-sized city that liked to call itself rugged and self-reliant, though most of that reputation was built on tourism brochures and a statue in front of the courthouse nobody could identify. The hospital itself was functional rather than impressive. 4 floors, an ER that handled everything from frostbite to farm accidents, and a staff of about 200 who all knew each other's business by Tuesday and gossiped about it by Thursday. Nora Voss had arrived 11 months ago with a clean record, solid references, and a quiet way of moving through a room that some people mistook for shyness. She had transferred from a hospital in Western Oregon where she'd spent 3 years building a reputation as a reliable, fast-thinking ER nurse. She wasn't flashy. She didn't talk much about herself. She put her head down, did the work, and went home to the small apartment on Delancey Street she'd been renting since she moved to Callaway. She'd been at Ridgeline for 2 weeks before Dr. Elliot Strand noticed her. He was the kind of man who filled every room he walked into, not because of anything earned, but because he expected to. Chief of Emergency Medicine at Ridgeline for 6 years, Strand had cultivated an air of surgical authority that everyone around him had long stopped questioning. He was good at his job. That part was true. He was also condescending, impatient, and had a particular habit of making examples out of people he considered beneath him, which, in his estimation, included most of the nursing staff. He noticed Nora the way a hawk notices something small moving in the grass. Nurse Voss. The first time he addressed her directly, it was in front of a patient, a family, and 4 other staff members. She had flagged a dosage she believed was off on a patient's chart. A woman in her 60s presenting with what she felt was early-stage cardiac involvement, being treated primarily for a panic attack. Nora had been careful, professional. She'd pulled Strand aside and asked if he'd had a chance to review the cardiac panel results. He hadn't reviewed them. That was the problem. "I've been treating emergency patients since before you passed your boards," Strand said, loud enough for the charge nurse to hear from the other end of the hall. "When I want your read on a clinical picture, I'll ask for it. Until then, I'd suggest you concern yourself with what's actually inside your job description." The patient in question was transferred to the cardiac unit 3 hours later with a confirmed arrhythmia. Nobody mentioned it. Strand didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge what had almost happened. He simply moved on to the next case, and the next, and the next, carrying his confidence like armor that no outcome could dent. Nora wrote it in her personal log that night, a small notebook she kept on her nightstand, in handwriting so compressed it looked like code. She documented the timeline, the labs, the dosage concern, the outcome. Not out of spite, not because she planned to use it, just because she'd learned a long time ago that the only thing you could control in a chaotic environment was what you paid attention to. Over the following months, Strand made her a recurring target. It was subtle at first. Small corrections issued publicly. Size time to land when she asked questions. A running pattern of redirecting her suggestions through other nurses as though she'd never spoken. Then it got less subtle. He began undermining her in front of patients. He questioned her IV placements in front of paramedics. Once, during a mass casualty drill, 3-car pileup, 7 simulated casualties, the whole department running hot, he pulled her from the lead trauma position mid-exercise and handed it to a newer nurse with 6 months of experience, while Nora stood at the edge of the room with both hands flat against the wall, breathing slowly, saying nothing. Her coworkers felt it. Some of them tried, in their way, to address it. Petra Holt, the senior charge nurse who'd worked Ridgeline's ER for 14 years, had pulled Nora into the break room twice to check on her. "You don't have to just take it," Petra said the second time. She was a direct woman, built like someone who'd never had time to be otherwise. "I'm not just taking it," Nora said. "Then what are you doing?" Nora looked at her. Watching. Petra hadn't known what to make of that. She'd let it go. What nobody at Ridgeline General knew, not Petra, not the ER staff, not the hospital administration, not Strand himself, was that before Nora Voss became an ER nurse in Western Oregon, before the references and the transfer and the quiet apartment on Delancey Street, she had spent 7 years as a combat medic in the United States Army, deployed twice to active combat zones, cross-trained with a Special Operations Support Unit in her second deployment, which meant her skill set went considerably past field triage. She had kept people alive in conditions that had nothing in common with a hospital: bad light, worse air, gunfire she learned to ignore the way civilians ignored traffic noise. She'd left the military at 27, not because she'd been forced out, not because of injury or politics. She'd left because she was tired in a way she hadn't been able to explain to anyone, and she thought that being a nurse in a civilian hospital might let her do the work without carrying the weight of everything that came with the uniform. She thought she might be able to disappear into it. Mostly, that had worked. She'd built a quiet life. She'd learned to exist without the particular vigilance that combat had installed in her, though she'd never fully uninstalled it. It lived somewhere below the surface, the way she always sat facing the door in restaurants, the way she clocked exits automatically, the way sudden loud sounds didn't make her flinch anymore, but made her go very, very still. She had a younger sister in Colorado she called on Sundays. She ran 5 miles every morning on the same route. She was 3 chapters into a novel she'd been meaning to finish for 8 months, and suspected she might never finish. She was fine. She was fine until the morning Dr. Strand called her into his office and placed a formal performance review across the desk. The document was 4 pages. It had been building for 2 months, she could tell. A compiled record of incidents framed to cast her as undependable, insubordinate, and poorly suited to emergency medicine. The language was careful, clinical. There was nothing in it that was outright false, but the framing was so selectively edited that the person described inside those pages was someone Nora didn't entirely recognize. She read all 4 pages in silence. Strand sat across from her with his hands folded, watching. "The review period closes at the end of next week," he said. "If the assessment stands, your contract won't be renewed. That's HR's determination, not mine, but my recommendation carries weight." "I understand," Nora said. "I hope you do. I've tried to be direct with you throughout your tenure here. You have skills, technically, but this department runs on a particular kind of trust between physicians and nursing staff, and I don't think that trust has ever developed between us." He was waiting for her to argue. She could see it in the way he was sitting, very slightly forward, prepared. She didn't argue. She picked up the review, folded it in half, and stood. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. She walked back to the ER. There were 14 days left on her contract. She started working them. But the shift that changed everything began on a Thursday, first week of February, outside temperature hovering at 11 degrees, the kind of cold Callaway got when the mountains stopped protecting it from whatever was moving down from Canada. The ER was running busy but not flooded. 3 in the morning, and the department had that particular exhausted rhythm that set in after midnight. Quieter, slower, staff talking in lower voices, the overhead lights feeling more harsh than usual against the dark outside. Nora was charting at the triage desk when the call came in from the night dispatcher at 3:17 a.m. 4-vehicle accident on Route 9. Mass casualty protocol. ETA 12 minutes. She was already moving when the second call came 3 minutes later. 911 had received reports of armed men at the hospital. The 2 calls landed almost simultaneously in the ER, and for approximately 90 seconds, nobody was entirely sure which to prioritize, the incoming ambulances or the security alert. The security guard at the main entrance, a retired sheriff's deputy named Walt, attempted to reach the front entrance on his radio. He didn't get through. The reason he didn't get through was that the 4 men had already come through the entrance. Nora heard the sliding doors before she saw them. There was a change in the air pressure, the brief blast of February cold, and then a sound she hadn't heard outside of a firing range or a combat zone in 3 years. The unmistakable hollow click of a weapon being chambered under stress, someone gripping too hard, thumb catching the slide. She looked up. 4 men. Armed. Moving with coordinated purpose. Not panicked, not frantic, but locked in and deliberate. The one in front, shorter than the others, compact, with a stillness in his eyes that Nora recognized from a certain kind of soldier, was the one giving quiet directions. He barely had to speak. The others oriented around him automatically. The leader. She cataloged the rest in under 4 seconds. The man on his left was the biggest, broadest, holding his weapon two-handed and sweeping it in arcs too wide to be controlled. Overextended. The one on the right was young, breathing too fast, weight shifting between his feet. Frightened. The 4th man hanging back near the entrance was watching the doors rather than the room. Lookout. Probably the weakest link at close range. Nora set her pen down. At the nurse's station to her left, 2 nurses had dropped below the desk. A third was frozen in the middle of the room with a medication cart, hands raised. 3 feet away, Dr. Strand stood absolutely motionless in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2, his face the color of fresh plaster, a tablet computer hanging from his hand like he'd forgotten it existed. She did not look at him for long. "Where is he?" The leader didn't raise his voice. He was speaking to the room, and the room understood. "We know he was brought here tonight. Don't make this complicated." The paramedics had brought in a young man 40 minutes ago. Late 20s, gunshot wound to the right shoulder, no ID. He'd been stabilized in Trauma Bay 1 and moved to a monitored bed in the Curtin Bay area. Nora didn't know who he was. She just knew where he was. She also knew that if these men found him before anything else happened, he was not going to survive the night. She stood up from behind the triage desk. "Sir?" Her voice came out level, no quaver, no performance, just level. "I'm the charge nurse. I can help you. What patient are you looking for?" The leader looked at her. Not with surprise exactly, but with the particular attention a person pays to something that didn't behave the way they expected. "You got a John Doe brought in tonight," he said. "Shooting victim." "We see a lot of shooting victims." She moved from behind the desk, keeping her hands in view, walking toward them at an angle, slightly diagonal, which kept her trajectory ambiguous and her body between the armed men and the nurse frozen near the medication cart. "You're going to need to be more specific." "Shoulder wound, young. He was conscious when they brought him in." "Okay." She nodded slowly, as if processing. "That might be the patient in the imaging suite. We had to move him for a scan. I can take you there." She didn't look back at Strand. She didn't look at the nurses behind the desk. She kept her eyes on the leader's face and started walking toward the corridor that led away from the curtain bays, away from where the man actually was, and toward the back section of the ER that housed the imaging equipment. A wing she'd clocked 3 months ago as the best choke point in the department, a single-entry corridor with a door that could be deadbolted from inside, and 2 small rooms that could serve as cover. She was 20 feet down the corridor before she heard footsteps following. 3 sets. The 4th man, the lookout, was staying at the entrance, which meant the most dangerous configuration was behind her. The leader, the big man with the wandering weapon, and the frightened young one. 3 of them. 1 corridor, limited visibility. She did the math. The imaging wing was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed. Nora moved to the MRI anteroom, a small space with a heavy door and a long, narrow window set at chest height, and stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "He would have been brought here for the shoulder imaging," she said, turning. "Let me unlock the suite." She turned her back to them. Her hands found the key ring on her badge lanyard. She'd been clipped to it since she started at Ridgeline, habit, and in the same motion, she dropped her keys entirely, stepped sideways, and drove her right elbow back into the young, frightened one's solar plexus with everything she had. He folded. The weapon came free before he finished folding. She had it out of his hand before his knees buckled, and she was already inside the arc of the big man's reach when he turned, stepping inside his guard, using his own mass to redirect him hard into the corridor wall. The impact was significant. He stayed down. The leader hadn't moved yet. He was 3 feet away with his weapon raised, and she was out of position, and the gun was trained at her chest, and this was the moment. "Put it on the floor," he said. She was holding the younger man's weapon. She could not raise it in time. She knew that. He knew that. She set it on the floor. Hands. She raised both hands, kept her face even. Her heart rate had not exceeded 140. She could tell by the clarity of her thoughts, the absence of tunnel vision. Training did that. You ran the body so hard for so long that even the worst moments couldn't fully override the circuitry. "You're a nurse," the leader said. He sounded almost amused, and Nora could hear underneath that amusement a layer of something else, the recalibration of someone encountering a variable they didn't account for. "Yes," she said, "that was a trained takedown." "My patient is not in this wing," she said. "I lied to you. I needed to get you away from him. I'd do it again." He stared at her. Something shifted in his face, the calculation behind his eyes going a different direction entirely. The radio at his belt crackled. "Units on scene." The voice was calm, institutional, and immediately recognizable as law enforcement dispatch. "All personnel, stand by." Through the narrow window in the corridor wall, red and blue light began strobing against the parking lot concrete, bright, insistent, reflecting off the snow-covered cars in the ER bay. SWAT had arrived. What happened next took 6 minutes and felt considerably longer. The leader made the decision in the span of about 4 seconds. He looked at the strobing light. He looked at Nora. He looked at the 2 men on the floor, one conscious, one not. And he made the kind of calculation that a man makes when he's been in enough of these situations to understand the math. He set the weapon on the floor. "Face down," Nora said, and her voice carried a frequency in it that she knew from experience ended arguments. "Hands behind your head." He did it. She kicked the weapon away, moved to the door, and pressed the intercom button on the wall. "This is Nora Voss, triage nurse, East Imaging Wing. I have 3 individuals detained. 2 need medical evaluation. 1 has blunt trauma to the thorax. 1 has a head laceration from wall contact. Leader is prone and uninjured. I need SWAT entry through the East Corridor, not the main ER. There's still a 4th subject at the front entrance." 40 seconds of silence. Then, "Copy that. Can you confirm your identity?" "Ridgeline badge number 774, Nora Voss. The 4th subject is standing near the sliding doors at the main ER entrance. Male, mid-30s, dark jacket, watching the parking lot." Another pause. Shorter. "Copy 774. Hold position." She held position. The leader on the floor turned his head slightly, just enough to look at her. "Who are you?" She didn't answer him. The SWAT team entered the East Corridor 4 minutes later, and Nora stepped back against the wall and let them work. She watched the controlled entry, the commands, the speed of the sweep, watched with the particular attention of someone who recognized the choreography. A sergeant, tall, ballistic vest, eyes moving systematically, stopped when he reached her. "You're the nurse who called in the position report?" "Yes." He looked at the 3 men on the floor and the 2 weapons she'd positioned against the far wall, then looked back at her. "How did you—" "My patients need to be checked," she said. "That's the priority. And the John Doe in Bay 7, the gunshot victim, he needs to be moved to a secure location. He's why they were here." The sergeant stared at her for a moment with an expression she'd received a handful of times in her life, usually from men in uniform who had just encountered something that didn't fit their existing category system. "We'll get to him," he said. "Get to him first," she said. He blinked. Then he keyed his radio. Chatin. The ER was still processing itself. Staff emerging from behind stations, a low hum of adrenaline and disbelief vibrating through the department. When Strand found her near the trauma bay entrance, standing with her arms at her sides while a tactical paramedic she didn't know checked a cut on her forearm she hadn't noticed. "Voss." He said her name like it required significant effort. She looked at him. His face had returned to something closer to normal color, though his eyes were still carrying the particular brightness that adrenaline left behind. "Are you—" He stopped, started again. "The patient's in Bay 7, is he—" "Stable," she said. SWAT has eyes on him. He'll be moved within the hour. Strand was quiet for a moment. The tactical paramedic finished her arm and moved away. That was... He stopped again. I know what it was, she said. Not unkindly, not with bitterness, just matter of fact. He looked at her like he was trying to locate the person he'd been writing a performance review about and couldn't quite find her anymore. The performance review, he started. Right now I have patience, she said, and moved past him into the ER. She was 20 feet away, already switching back to the work, when two men in plain clothes and federal credentials came through the main entrance, and one of them, a man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the posture of someone who'd never entirely left the military, stopped dead when he saw her. He looked at her across the length of the ER floor, and she looked at him. And 11 months of quiet living snapped clean, like a wire under too much tension, because she recognized him, and the expression on his face told her that whatever had just happened in that imaging wing was only the beginning of something she hadn't known she was standing in the middle of. His name was Warren Galt. She hadn't seen him in 4 years, and she hadn't expected to see him ever again. Not because anything had ended badly between them, but because the world he belonged to and the world she'd built for herself in Callaway were supposed to be entirely separate. He was the kind of person you didn't run into accidentally. His presence in a place meant something. It always had. Galt crossed the ER floor with the particular economy of movement that never leaves a person who's spent enough time in tactical environments. Weight forward, eyes tracking, nothing wasted. The second man with him was younger, harder-faced, wearing the expression of someone actively cataloging every detail of the room. Federal, clearly, but not the same agency. Voss? Galt stopped 2 feet from her. He didn't extend a hand. Colonel. She hadn't called him that in 4 years either. It came out automatically. Retired, he said. Still. He looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that was doing more work than it appeared to, taking inventory, adjusting something internally. Then he glanced at the cut on her forearm, the slight disarray of her scrubs, the absolute stillness of her posture. You want to tell me what happened in that imaging wing? 3 subjects detained, 2 disarmed. I gave a position report to SWAT. They handled entry. She kept her voice even. You want to tell me why a retired Army colonel just walked into my ER at 3:40 in the morning? Conference room, he said. 10 minutes, please. The please surprised her. Galt had never been much for please. The conference room was on the 2nd floor, a beige box with a table that seated 8 and a whiteboard that someone had never fully erased. Galt's partner set a laptop on the table without introducing himself and started pulling up files. Galt stood near the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the parking lot where 3 tactical vehicles were still positioned near the entrance. The man in Bay 7, Galt said without turning. His name is Marcus Teller, 29 years old, former associate of the Kessler Syndicate. You won't know that name, but federal organized crime has been building a case against them for 2 years. Teller turned informant 8 weeks ago. He was placed in a protection arrangement in Billings. Was, Nora said. His location was compromised. Someone told the Kessler people where to find him. Galt turned then. He ran, took a round in the shoulder, and your paramedics picked him up on Route 9 without knowing who he was. Nora sat back in her chair. The pieces were settling into a shape she didn't like. So the men who came through our ER tonight were sent to finish what started on Route 9, yes. Galt pulled out a chair across from her, but didn't sit in it yet, just held the back of it. The federal protection arrangement for Teller has now failed twice. Tonight's breach wasn't random, someone knew which hospital the paramedics were bringing him to before the ambulance arrived. The room was quiet for a moment. That's an internal leak, Nora said. That's one possibility. She watched him. What's the other possibility? He finally sat. That it's a leak from inside this hospital. She didn't move, didn't react, just held the thought for a moment, turning it over. I've been here 11 months, she said. I don't know anything about Marcus Teller or the Kessler Syndicate or a federal protection case. I know. Then why are you sitting across from me instead of somewhere else? Galt laced his fingers together on the table. He had a way of looking at a person that communicated both complete attention and a careful withholding of his own position. She'd seen him do it 100 times in briefings. It used to read as strength. Right now it was making her nervous. "Because you're the only person in this building who took any action tonight," he said. "Everyone else froze. And the action you took was specific, deliberate. It showed a read of the tactical situation that goes beyond anything in your nursing background." "You already know my background." "I do." "Then you know I'm out." "I know you said you were out." She held his gaze. "I am out, Warren." He didn't push it. He opened his laptop and turned it toward her, and for the next 40 minutes they talked. Or rather, he laid out the structure of the Kessler investigation in enough detail that she understood the stakes, and she asked questions with the precision of someone who had spent years in environments where imprecise questions got people killed. Galt's partner, who finally introduced himself as Agent Dale Burris, FBI field office out of Helena, pulled up organizational charts, financial records, the fragmented profile of a syndicate that had moved from regional drug operations into something considerably larger and harder to track. Marcus Teller was the key. He had documentation, physical documentation, not digital, that could place the syndicate's leadership at the site of 3 murders. Without him, the case was circumstantial. With him, it was airtight. "He needs to testify," Burris said. "He can't testify if they get to him first." "He needs his shoulder properly managed before anything else," Nora said. "That wound was stabilized, not repaired. He needs surgery within the next 12 hours, or he's looking at permanent damage." Burris looked at Galt. Galt looked at Nora. "Can you supervise his care?" Galt asked. "I'm a nurse," she said flatly, "not a surgeon." "I'm aware, but you have insight into his security requirements that none of the surgical staff here does. I need someone who can communicate between the medical team and the tactical detail." He paused. "Someone I trust." There it was. She'd heard it coming for the last 20 minutes, the slow, careful construction of a request she hadn't agreed to yet. She stood up. "Let me check on my patients first." The ER below had settled into a different kind of motion, the aftermath motion, slower and more deliberate than crisis, full of people processing what had just happened in their bodies and not yet in their heads. Petra was behind the main desk, managing the incoming documentation with the grim efficiency she brought to everything. She looked up when Nora came through. "You're bleeding through that bandage," Petra said. "I know. I'll redo it." Nora stopped at the desk. "Bay 7, what's his status?" "Stable. 2 tactical officers outside the curtain. Surgical consult is on his way in." Petra looked at her with that direct gaze she had, the one that didn't leave room for deflection. 3 of those men are in custody. The 4th one they caught at the entrance. All 4. "Good." "Nora." Petra lowered her voice. "What happened in that imaging wing? The SWAT sergeant asked me twice if you had any specialized training, and I didn't know what to tell him." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Tell him I've worked in high-pressure environments," she said. Petra's expression said very clearly that this was not a satisfying answer. "The review," Nora said. "Strand's review. Is it going through HR tomorrow?" "I don't—" Petra stopped. "After tonight? I don't think anyone knows what's happening tomorrow." Nora nodded and moved on. She stopped by Bay 7 and looked through the curtain gap without disturbing the tactical officer outside. Teller was sedated, vitals on the monitor, the shoulder packed and dressed. He looked younger lying down, boyish in a way that made the situation feel heavier, because people who got used by powerful organizations for their knowledge tended to end up in exactly this position. Alone, injured, waiting to find out if the protection they'd been promised was going to hold. She moved on. She was rewrapping her forearm at the supply station near the trauma bays when Dr. Strand appeared in her peripheral vision. He'd changed his coat. The earlier one must have gotten something on it. And he had the look of a man who had been thinking hard about something for the past hour and had arrived at a decision that cost him something. "I need to speak with you," he said. "I'm working." "I know, this won't take long." He glanced around, not nervously but with purpose, making sure no one was in earshot. "I owe you an apology." Nora finished wrapping her arm, tore the tape, smoothed it down. "You don't have to—" "I do. What you did tonight—" He stopped. Reset. I've been in emergency medicine for 16 years. I've run mass casualty drills, trauma activations, active shooter protocols. I know the theory of how to behave when something like tonight happens. His jaw tightened. I froze. A lot of people froze, she said. I'm not talking about a lot of people. I'm talking about me. He held her gaze. The arrogance she'd been navigating for 11 months was still visible in his face. It wasn't gone. It wasn't something that got erased in a night. But it was sitting differently, weighted by something genuine. The performance review. I'll have it pulled. You don't have to do that tonight. I understand, but I wanted you to know. He paused. Who are those men upstairs? The ones who came in with federal credentials? Nora looked at him, not with suspicion, exactly, more with the particular attentiveness she'd been applying to everything since Galt walked through the door. I don't have clearance to discuss that, she said. Something moved across his face. Quick, unidentifiable. There and gone. Of course, he said, and walked away. She watched him go. The next 3 hours were simultaneously bureaucratic and exhausting. Federal agents documenting the crime scene, hospital administration arriving in force somewhere around 5 a.m., 2 separate interviews with law enforcement where Nora answered questions with careful precision and gave them exactly what they needed without elaborating on anything she didn't have to. The SWAT sergeant, his name turned out to be Harlan Rook, interviewed her for 40 minutes and came out of it looking like a man who had more questions than when he'd started. Teller went into surgery at 6:15. The surgical team was briefed on security requirements. 2 tactical officers in the OR. No digital record of his patient file linked to the hospital's main network. Galt had requested that, and the hospital administrator, a pale, sweating man named Gerald Foss, who had clearly never anticipated anything like this, had agreed to everything Galt asked within about 90 seconds. Nora managed the handoff. She coordinated between the surgical team and Burris's people. She ran down a supply issue that had delayed the start of surgery by 15 minutes and fixed it by walking to the supply room herself and locating the specific instrument tray that had been misfiled. She did all of it on no sleep, on a forearm that was starting to ache properly now that the adrenaline had left, and on the particular grim determination that takes over when the work is the only thing keeping a person from fully registering how strange the night has been. It was 7:40 in the morning when Galt found her in the stairwell. Not dramatically, just practically, because the stairwell was the only quiet place in the building at that hour. He sat on the step beside her without asking. She had a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and was staring at the landing below. Teller is in recovery, he said. I know, they told me. Burris got the ballistics report from the Route 9 scene. The round they pulled out of Teller's shoulder doesn't match any weapon recovered from the 4 men we arrested tonight. She looked at him. The shooter who hit him on Route 9 wasn't one of the 4 who came here, Galt said. Which means there's another principle in this that we haven't identified. Someone who was at the initial intercept and didn't follow the others to the hospital. Or someone who sent the others and wasn't at the intercept at all, Nora said. Also possible. She turned the cup in her hands. You said someone leaked Teller's hospital destination before the ambulance arrived. That's what the timeline suggests. The paramedics would have radioed in their destination when they picked him up. That goes through dispatch. But dispatch coordinates with hospital receiving at... Someone in this hospital knew he was coming before the ambulance pulled in. We know. Have you looked at everyone who was on shift when the radio call came in? We're building that list. He paused. Nora, I need to ask you something directly. Then ask it. Before tonight, in the months you've been working here, have you noticed anything? Anything that felt off? Staff behavior, unusual access patterns? Anyone who asked about patient information in ways that felt sideways? She was quiet for a moment. The stairwell hummed with the low vibration of the building's HVAC system. One thing, she said. He waited. It's probably nothing. Probably nothing is how half of these cases break, he said. She thought about the expression on Strand's face. Quick, unidentifiable, there and gone, when she'd told him she couldn't discuss the federal credentials. And she thought about the question he'd asked. Who are those men? Not asked with alarm or curiosity, asked with a flatness that, now that she was sitting here turning it over, felt less like a physician's detachment and more like someone checking to see how much she knew. She didn't say Strand's name yet. She wasn't there yet. She was precise about this sort of thing, had been trained to be, had learned the cost of imprecision. "Let me think about it," she said. Galt nodded, accepting that, which told her he already had his own suspicions and was watching to see if hers aligned. She stood, dropping the untouched coffee in the trash. "I have a shift in 90 minutes, she said. "My patients need me on that floor." "You've been here since 11 p.m. yesterday." "I know what time it is, Warren." She pushed through the stairwell door. The ER below her was brightening into morning, staff changing over, the overnight replacing itself with the day shift who were arriving to find their department cordoned in sections, federal agents still at 2 of the exits, and a rumor already circulating. She could hear it in the way people were talking, too fast, too much, that the night nurse who'd been on Strand's hit list had locked 3 armed men in the imaging wing alone. She heard her name twice before she reached the trauma bay. She didn't stop for it. She had 90 minutes before her shift technically restarted, and she needed to use them, because something had been sitting at the back of her mind since Galt mentioned the unmatched ballistics. The shooter who hadn't followed the others to the hospital. The one who'd put a round in Teller's shoulder on Route 9 and then disappeared. The paramedic report from the Route 9 pickup had listed Teller as the only casualty, but there had been a second vehicle at the scene. She'd caught it in the paramedic's verbal report when they'd radioed ahead. A dark sedan, engine running, no driver visible. No driver visible, which meant the driver had been somewhere else. She was at the supply station, pulling up the intake log from 3 a.m., when she found it, a notation she hadn't registered at the time, hadn't had reason to register. At 3:09 a.m., 8 minutes before the 4 armed men came through the entrance, someone had accessed the hospital's internal record system from the physician workstation outside Trauma Bay 2. Dr. Strand's workstation. At 3:09 a.m. He'd told her he'd been in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2 when the men came through. She'd seen him there herself. But if he'd been standing in that hallway, why had someone used his workstation 8 minutes before the breach? The log showed a single access event. Patient record retrieved, Marcus Teller's intake file. She stood very still for a moment. Then she pulled her phone out of her pocket and called Galt. He picked up on the second ring. "You found something," he said. He didn't make it a question. "Someone accessed Teller's file from a physician workstation at 3:09 a.m., she said. 8 minutes before the breach. The workstation is registered to Strand." A pause. Short, controlled. "Can you document that log entry without alerting the system administrator?" "I can pull a screenshot right now." "Do it. Don't send it through the hospital network. Send it to the number I'm going to text you in 30 seconds. He hung up. The text came through. She documented the log entry, cross-referenced the timestamp against the ER camera footage she could access from the nursing station. And there it was, 3:09 a.m. on the corridor camera. Dr. Elliot Strand at his workstation, not standing in the hallway, not frozen in shock yet, but seated, typing, and then standing, and moving to the hallway, and positioning himself where she'd found him 8 minutes later. She sent everything to Galt's number. And then she stood there in the corridor of her ER in the early February morning and tried to reconcile the man who had looked at her an hour ago with something genuine in his eyes. I froze. I owe you an apology. With the man who had looked up Teller's file 8 minutes before armed men came to kill him. Her phone buzzed. Not Galt's number. The hospital's internal system. A message from hospital administration routed to all senior nursing staff. Dr. Strand has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending review. Please direct all departmental questions to the acting chief. More information to follow. She read it twice. They'd moved faster than she'd expected, which meant Galt had already had this, that had already known something, already had the log, and had been waiting to see if she'd find it too. She was still reading the message when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened, and Burris stepped out. And behind him, a woman Nora had never seen. Mid-40s, dark coat, the kind of posture that came from years of institutional authority, looked directly at Nora across the length of the hall with an expression that was not friendly, not hostile, but deeply, carefully assessing. Burris saw Nora's face and said something to the woman. The woman nodded once, slowly, and kept looking at Nora. Burris crossed the corridor and stopped in front of her. "Special agent in charge, Veda Marsh," he said quietly. "She runs the Organized Crime Task Force out of Washington. She flew in 40 minutes ago." He paused. "She wants to talk to you about Strand, and she's not the only one who flew in tonight." "What does that mean?" Burris glanced back at Marsh, then returned to Nora with the expression of someone about to hand a person something heavy. "There's a second federal case," he said. "Running parallel to ours, classified, and whoever is running it seems to think that what happened here tonight isn't about the Kessler Syndicate at all. It's about something that started a long time before Marcus Teller ever turned informant." Nora looked past him at Marsh, who was still watching her with that measuring stillness. "Strand didn't act alone," Burris said. "There's someone above him in this, and that someone has a military background." The floor felt very slightly different beneath her feet. "How military?" she said. Burris held her gaze. "Your kind of military," he said. The words landed and stayed there. "Your kind of military." Nora held Burris's gaze for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than she needed to understand that he meant exactly what he'd said. "Give me a name," she said. "Not here." He glanced toward the nurses' station where 2 staff members were watching them with badly concealed curiosity. "Marsh wants to brief you in a controlled environment, off-site. I have patience. Galt is arranging coverage. Petra Holt has been briefed enough to manage the floor." He paused. "Nora, this isn't optional. Marsh doesn't fly in from Washington for optional conversations." She looked down the corridor at Veda Marsh, who had moved to the window and was looking out at the parking lot with her hands clasped behind her back, the posture of someone comfortable waiting and equally comfortable ending that patience on short notice. The morning light was coming through at a flat angle, and it made the corridor feel longer than it was. "Give me 10 minutes, Nora said. She went to the locker room, washed her face, changed the bandage on her forearm properly this time. The cut was shallow, would close on its own, didn't need sutures, though it had needed them last night, and she'd chosen not to deal with it, and stood at the sink for a moment looking at herself in the mirror. She looked like what she was, a person who had been awake since 11 p.m., had disarmed 2 men in an imaging corridor, spent the night managing a federal protection case she hadn't agreed to be part of, and was now being told that the conspiracy she'd stumbled into was connected to something classified. She looked tired. She also looked, she noted with some detachment, completely steady. Some things didn't leave you. The off-site was a regional FBI field annex, a nondescript office building on Callaway's west side that she'd driven past 100 times without registering it. 3rd floor, a conference room with actual decent lighting and a coffee setup that someone had clearly deployed with intention. Galt was already there when she arrived. So was a man she didn't know. Late 40s, compact, wearing a suit that was slightly too formal for a field environment, which told her he was more comfortable in offices than out of them. He introduced himself as Reeves and didn't offer a last name or a title, which told her the title was the kind that didn't get said out loud in casual settings. Marsh sat at the head of the table. She was precise in person, not cold exactly, but economical. The kind of person who had learned to deliver information without decorating it. "Dr. Strand will be formally arrested this afternoon," Marsh began, before anyone had fully settled. He accessed Teller's intake record and transmitted the hospital location to a relay contact. "We have the transmission log. He's not disputing it." She laid a photograph on the table, saw a printout, not a screen, and pushed it toward Nora. "But Strand is downstream. He received the directive from someone else, someone who knew about Teller's protection status, knew his medical condition required hospital transport, and positioned the relay through Strand as a cutout." Nora looked at the photograph. It was a man in his late 50s, silver-haired, straight-backed, with the jaw and the eyes of someone who had once been genuinely formidable. She knew the type. She had served under the type. She had also, on 2 occasions, served alongside operatives who had been burned by the type, men who wore institutional authority like a second skin and used it to move things that weren't theirs to move. She didn't recognize him specifically, but she recognized the category, and her stomach did something quiet and unpleasant. "His name is Roland Hask," Marsh said. Former Lieutenant Colonel, Defense Intelligence Agency. Retired 7 years ago under circumstances that were, officially, a voluntary separation. Unofficially, there was an internal investigation that didn't produce enough to prosecute. Alleged sale of classified operational intelligence to foreign intermediaries. The investigation was shelved. Shelved by whom? Nora asked. Marsh's expression didn't change. That's one of the questions. Reeves leaned forward then, folding his hands on the table with the deliberateness of someone accustomed to controlling the pace of briefings. Hask has been operating as a private intelligence contractor since separation. Legitimate clients on paper. But our parallel investigation, which predates the Kessler case by 14 months, has been building a picture of Hask as the primary source for classified witness location data that has resulted in the deaths of at least 4 federal informants over the past 3 years. The room was quiet for a moment. He's been selling protective custody locations, Nora said. Locations, cover identities, handler assignments, anything he can access through residual contacts inside the intelligence community. Reeves held her gaze. Teller is the 5th informant he's targeted. The first 4 didn't survive. Galt, who had been sitting with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, spoke for the first time. Hask knew Teller's protection arrangement because someone inside the federal system is still feeding him access. We don't know who. That's the active leak we haven't closed. And Strand was his local cutout, Nora said. How did Hask get to Strand? Marsh slid another photograph across the table. A younger woman, early 20s, dark-haired, photographed from a distance in what looked like a university parking lot. Strand has a daughter, Marsh said. Calla Strand, 22. Graduate student at University of Montana. 6 weeks ago, she was approached by individuals we now believe are connected to Hask's operation. She was photographed in several locations. The implication was made. Nora looked at the photograph. The young woman had her father's jaw and the slightly hunched posture of someone who spent a lot of time carrying things she wasn't sure how to put down. He was coerced, Nora said. He made a choice, Marsh said, with the flatness of someone who had learned not to let coercion function as full absolution. But yes, the daughter's safety was the leverage. Nora thought about Strand in the corridor an hour ago. The apology. The genuine things she'd seen in his face. She thought about the expression she'd clocked and then set aside, the one that had felt off. Not guilt about what he'd done to her, guilt about what he'd done, period. He'd known, as he stood there apologizing about a performance review, that he'd given a man's location to people who intended to kill him. The weight of that had been sitting on him. She'd seen it and read it wrong. What do you need from me? She asked. Marsh looked at her steadily. Hask knows this operation failed. 4 of his people are in custody, Teller is alive, and Strand will be arrested within hours. He'll know his cutout is compromised. He'll run. He'll try to clean up first, Reeves said. That's his pattern. Before he runs, he removes loose ends. The investigation we've been building, if Hask gets to his contacts inside the intelligence community, before we can move, we lose the case. The internal leak he's been using will disappear, the access trail goes cold, and we're back to circumstantial. You need to move on him now, Nora said. We need to move on him now, Marsh said. But we have a problem. Hask is not operating within standard surveillance parameters. He moves. He changes locations frequently. We have a last known position in the Bitterroot Valley, a property registered to a shell company. But by the time we build a probable cause affidavit for a judicial warrant, he'll have moved. Nora saw it coming. She saw it the way you see a vehicle drifting into your lane from 200 meters. Enough time to note it, not enough time to pretend it isn't happening. You want bait, she said. Silence. Someone he doesn't know is compromised. Someone he'd want to make contact with. She looked at Galt. What does he know about what happened at the hospital tonight? He knows his team failed, Galt said carefully. He knows Teller is alive. He doesn't know the extent of what we've recovered from the hospital system, and he doesn't know... He stopped. He doesn't know about me, she said. Your involvement wasn't in any official report filed before this morning. The SWAT after action lists you as a civilian who assisted. No detail. She looked at the photograph of Hask, the jaw, the eyes, the specific kind of stillness that came from a person who had spent decades in environments where stillness was a professional asset. What's my approach? She asked. Marsh actually blinked, just once, a small recalibration. We're not asking you to... You were about to, Nora said. I'm not being difficult. I'm asking what the approach would be. They spent 90 minutes building it. Hask had a residual network of former military and intelligence contacts, people he'd worked with over a career, some of whom had stayed loyal out of genuine connection, some out of self-interest, and some, the investigation suggested, out of fear. One of those contacts was a former Army logistics officer named Whitfield, who had served in the same theater as Nora's second deployment. Whitfield had been interviewed once in the parallel investigation and released. He was considered a minor figure, too peripheral to be directly useful, too connected to be fully dismissed. But Whitfield and Nora had overlapped for 6 weeks in a forward operating base outside of Kandahar. They'd worked together twice. His name was in her service record. If Hask is checking his exposure points after tonight, Burris said, walking through the scenario at the whiteboard, Whitfield is someone he'd contact for information about who might be talking. Whitfield is nervous. We know from our surveillance that he's been trying to distance himself from Hask since last month. He might be persuaded to make an introduction. To whom? Nora asked. To a former Army medic who was at Ridgeline General tonight and saw something she shouldn't have. Someone who's scared, wants to understand what she walked into, and is looking for assurance that she's not going to end up as a loose end. That's an ambiguous offer, she said. Hask would verify it. He'd want a meeting in person before he trusted it. Yes, Galt said, and the meeting location would be his choice, which means we'd need to cover multiple contingencies for wherever he selects. Yes, Galt said again, and there's an active leak inside the federal system that hasn't been identified yet, so anything we plan could be compromised before it executes. This time Galt didn't answer immediately. That answer was its own answer. She looked at the whiteboard. The scenario was laid out in boxes and arrows, the way tactical plans always were. Clean and logical on a surface, full of the places where reality didn't cooperate, living in the white space between the lines. I need to go back to the hospital, she said. Marsh frowned. We'd prefer... I have a patient in surgical recovery who is the entire reason any of this matters. I need to check on him, and I need to think. She stood. I'll have an answer for you by noon. She left before Marsh could redirect her. Teller was out of surgery and in a monitored recovery room on the 3rd floor, a room that now had 2 tactical officers outside the door and a camera mounted in the corner that hadn't been there yesterday. The surgical resident who'd assisted on the procedure, a young woman named Dr. Osei, who looked like she'd had approximately as much sleep as Nora, caught her in the hallway outside. He's stable, Osei said. We got the fragment, repaired the subscapularis tear. Full ROM is possible with rehab, but it's going to be a long haul. She hesitated. He was asking for someone named Voss when he came out of anesthesia. Nora stopped. He was asking for me? He didn't know your name. He said the nurse, the one who was on shift when they brought him in. Osei glanced at the door. He seems to think you're the reason he's still alive. Nora pushed the door open. Teller looked worse in recovery than he had in the trauma bay, which was normal, the body's delayed accounting for what it had been through. But his eyes were open and tracking when she came in, and they fixed on her with a focus that cut through the sedation residue. You're her, he said. His voice was rough. I'm the nurse who was on when they brought you in. How's the pain? Managed. He shifted slightly, winced, stopped. They told me what happened with the men who came in. You don't need to worry about that. I've been not worrying about things for 8 weeks, and it keeps not working. He looked at her with eyes that were clearer than they had any right to be, given what was running through his IV. Is it over? She could have told him yes. It would have been the easier thing to say. But she'd stopped being comfortable with comfortable lies somewhere around her second deployment, and she couldn't manufacture the conviction to deliver one now. Not yet, she said, but you're safe in this room. He held her gaze. The men who sent those 4, they're still out there. The people handling your case are working on it. That's not... He stopped, swallowed. That's not a no. No? She said. It's not. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not collapse, not panic, but a particular kind of exhaustion that Nora recognized as the feeling of a person who has been terrified for a long time and is running low on the energy to keep processing it. "I have documentation," he said. "Physical, not on me. I have it stored." He looked at her again. "If something happens to me before I testify, tell your handler. My handler's network has a leak. You know that. You're standing in this room because someone inside the system sold my location." His jaw tightened. "I'm not telling my handler. I'm telling you." Nora stood very still. "Mr. Teller, storage unit," he said quietly. "Facility on the north end of Billings, Unit 47. Key is taped inside the battery compartment of my phone." He paused. "The phone is in a bag somewhere in this hospital. Property lockup, probably." "I understand," she said. "Do you?" "Yes." He held her gaze for another moment, then let his head fall back against the pillow. She left the room and stood in the hallway outside, both tactical officers watching her with the particular neutrality of men who had been told not to ask questions about anything they heard. She pulled out her phone and called Galt. "I'll do it," she said when he picked up, "but I have conditions." "Tell me." But Teller's documentation needs to be secured independently, outside of the federal evidence chain until the internal leak is identified. "I'll explain why when I see you." She moved down the hallway, away from the tactical officer's earshot. "And Strand's daughter needs active protection before anything else moves. If Hask knows Strand is compromised, she's the most exposed person in this situation right now." A pause. "Agreed on the daughter, the documentation. Non-negotiable, Warren." Another pause. Longer. "Agreed," he said. She hung up. She was at the elevator when Petra caught her, moving fast for a woman who had been on shift for 9 hours, holding a tablet and looking like someone who had been waiting to say something for the last 3. "The administrator wants to speak with you," Petra said. "Tell him I'm unavailable." He's been saying that the federal situation is creating a liability concern for the hospital, and he wants a statement from nursing staff about Petra. Nora stopped. "Is any patient in this hospital in immediate danger right now?" Petra blinked. "No." "Is the ER staffed?" "Yes." "Then tell Gerald Foss that I'll speak with him when I have something to say to him." She stepped into the elevator. "And tell him that the hospital's liability is the least complicated thing about today." The elevator closed. On the ride down, she stood with her eyes forward and ran the scenario as Galt's team had laid it out. The approach through Whitfield, the meeting with Hask, the contingencies, the white space between the lines. She was good at finding the white space. She'd always been good at it. It was the thing that had made her useful in the field. The ability to see not just the plan, but the shape of everything the plan hadn't accounted for. What she kept coming back to was the internal leak. Hask was still getting information from inside the federal system, which meant if the approach through Whitfield was planned in any standard briefing room, in any documented channel, through any communication that touched the operational network that Hask had compromised, he'd know before the introduction was made. The plan only worked if nobody inside the system knew there was a plan, which meant the briefing she'd just left, Marsh, Galt, Burris, Reeves, was already compromised as a planning environment, which meant Nora couldn't tell any of them what she was actually going to do. She stepped off the elevator on the ground floor and walked to the nurse's locker room, sat on the bench in front of her locker, and thought it through for 4.5 minutes. Then she took out her personal phone, not the one she'd been using for the federal contacts, her own phone, the one she paid for on a civilian plan and that had never been connected to any operational network, and sent a single text message to a number she still knew by memory, even though she'd told herself for 4 years she'd never need it again. "Whitfield. It's Voss. I need 30 minutes and I need you not to tell anyone I called. I'll explain everything. Call me on this number." She stared at the message for a moment. Then she sent it. The reply came in 40 seconds, just 5 words. "I've been waiting for this." Something cold moved through her. Not fear, or not only fear, but the particular sensation of a pattern clicking into a shape she hadn't been ready to see. Whitfield had been waiting. Not for her specifically, not for this call. For something. For someone to make a move, to open a channel, or to give him a reason to do something he'd already been building toward. She called Galt immediately. "The leak," she said. It's not someone Hask recruited. It's someone who's been feeding him willingly. She stood up. Whitfield. He's not peripheral. He's the source. Silence on the line. Then Galt, very carefully. What makes you say that? I just texted him, using a number Hask's network doesn't have. I gave him nothing. No context, no operational detail, just my name and a request to call. He responded in 40 seconds, Warren. He said he'd been waiting. The pause was longer this time. Where are you right now? Galt said. Locker room, ground floor. Do not leave that room. I'm calling Marsh. There's something else, she said. Whitfield's response, it changes the approach. He's not going to introduce me to Hask. He's going to report to Hask that I reached out, which means Hask will already know my name before any introduction happens. She stopped. But it also means we can control what Whitfield tells him. Another silence. She could hear Galt processing. You want to use Whitfield's report as the introduction, he said slowly. If Whitfield tells Hask that a former Army medic who was at Ridgeline tonight reached out and seems frightened and wants to talk, and if Hask believes that I'm a loose end he needs to assess personally, he comes to you instead of you going to him, Galt said. On a location we choose in conditions we control, without Hask knowing there's an operational plan in place. She paused. Because there isn't one yet. Nothing's been filed. Nothing's been communicated through any network he has access to. Galt was quiet for 4 full seconds. This has to happen in the next 6 hours, he said. After that, Strand's arrest is public record, and Hask goes to ground. I know. Nora? His voice shifted. Not softer, but more direct. If we set this up and the timeline compresses, if Hask moves faster than the tactical team can position, I've been in worse positions, she said. You've been out for 4 years. The imaging wing was 4 hours ago, she said. I'm fine. A long breath. I'll call Marsh. She sat back down on the bench and looked at her phone. Whitfield's message was still on the screen, those 5 words sitting there with their particular weight. Her hand was not shaking. She noted that with something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, more like the flat recognition of a fact. Whatever she'd been telling herself for 4 years about who she was now and who she used to be, the body had its own memory, and right now it remembered clearly. Her phone buzzed again. Not Galt. Not Whitfield. An unknown number. Montana area code. She stared at it. It buzzed a second time. She answered. The voice on the other end was unhurried, measured, and carried the specific, polished authority of a man who had never in his professional life been spoken to without deference. Ms. Voss, Roland Hask said, I think we should meet. She didn't answer immediately. That was the first thing, the most important thing, because the instinct was to speak. And speaking before you'd assess the situation was how people gave away what they knew and didn't know within the first 15 seconds of a contact. She held the phone against her ear and let the silence run for 4 full beats. You have the wrong number, she said. I don't think so. Hask's voice was patient in a way that communicated he had done this before, opened conversations with people who were frightened or pretending not to be, and waited them out. You reached out to an associate of mine 40 minutes ago. I thought it would be more efficient to skip the introduction. Whitfield had contacted him before calling her back. The 40-second response time. He hadn't been waiting for her call. He'd been waiting for any call, any signal, and the moment he had one, he'd gone directly to Hask. She made herself breathe evenly. I don't know who your associate is, she said, and I don't know who you are. My name isn't important. What's important is that you were at Ridgeline General Hospital last night, and you saw things that put you in a complicated position, and I think you understand that. A pause. Brief. Calibrated. I'm not calling to threaten you, Ms. Voss. I'm calling because I think we can resolve your situation in a way that works for everyone. This was the pitch. She recognized it. The particular construction of a man who had spent a career recruiting assets, which meant building a frame in which the target believed they were being offered a door rather than being walked toward a wall. What situation? She said. You assisted federal agents this morning. You provided information. You're now part of an investigation that is considerably more complex than anyone has explained to you. Another pause. The people you've been speaking with have their own agenda, and it doesn't include protecting you when this becomes inconvenient. I can offer something they can't. Which is clarity, he said, and safety. Meet me. 2 hours. You choose the location, somewhere public, somewhere you're comfortable. I'll come alone. He wouldn't come alone. She knew that the same way she knew the offer of a location choice was a performance of deference designed to manufacture trust. But the offer itself was the thing that mattered. He wanted the meeting, which meant he needed to assess her in person, which meant he wasn't yet certain how much she knew or what she'd given the federal team. I need time to think, she said. Of course. I'll call back in 30 minutes. The line went dead. She sat for exactly 3 seconds. Then she called Galt. He picked up mid-first ring. I heard. Marsh has the number. We're running it now. Burner, she said. Don't waste time on it. He called because Whitfield told him I reached out on a clean number. He wants to assess me before he runs. He thinks I'm frightened and confused, and he's offering me a way out. Which means he doesn't know you're working with us. He suspects. That's why he wants the meeting, to determine which side of the line I'm actually on. She stood up, moved to the locker room door, checked the corridor. Empty. I want to take it. Nora, he offered me location choice. That's real. He'll honor it. Reneging on that would destroy the trust frame he's building, and he knows it. If I choose correctly, we can position the tactical team before he arrives. She was already moving down the corridor. What's the response time for your people if I give a confirmed location? She heard Galt cover the phone, brief exchange with someone, so Marsh probably, then back, 40 minutes to position, 60 to be airtight. I'll push the meeting to 90 minutes. Tell him I need to make arrangements. She paused. And Warren, the internal leak. Whitfield is confirmed, but if Hask has a second source inside your team's communication network, any location we discuss on this line is compromised. The silence was long enough to be its own confirmation of her concern. Use the secondary channel, he said. The one I texted you this morning, it's sandboxed. Send me the location options on that channel. I'll choose and confirm directly with your tactical lead. Not through Marsh, not through Burris. Just your tactical lead, and me. Another pause. You don't trust Marsh. I don't know who I trust yet. I trust you. That's what I'm working with. She hung up. The location she chose was the Mill Point Cold Storage Facility on Callaway's Industrial East Side, a legitimate commercial operation, publicly accessible loading dock, 3 entry points, wide sightlines from the elevated railroad bed to the north that would give a sniper team clean coverage of the approach. She'd driven past it 6 times in 11 months, had noted its geometry the way she noted everything, without deciding to, without knowing she'd ever need it. She texted the location to Galt's tactical lead, a man named Rourke, whose number Galt sent through the sandbox channel, and received a single word back within 4 minutes, confirmed. When Hask called back at the 30-minute mark, she gave him the location and the time. He accepted both without negotiating, which was itself a data point. Either he was confident in his own team's ability to cover any location she chose, or he was more desperate to make this contact than he'd allowed his voice to suggest. She spent the next hour doing something that surprised even herself. She went back to work. Not because she was pretending nothing was happening, not as performance, but because there were patients on that floor, and Teller needed a wound check, and the ER below was running its morning routine with a skeleton crew because half the overnight staff had been held for federal interviews, and the work was there and it needed doing, and she was the person who could do it. She checked Teller's dressing, clean, no sign of early infection, the surgical repair holding properly, and updated his chart with the morning vitals in the careful, specific shorthand she'd developed over years. She fielded 2 questions from the day shift nurses about the investigation's effect on ER protocols and gave them answers that were honest without being operationally compromising. She ate half a granola bar from the break room and threw the rest away because she wasn't actually hungry, just running low. At 11:40, she changed out of her scrubs in the locker room and pulled on the clothes she kept in her emergency bag. Dark jeans, a heavy pullover, boots with ankle support, the kind of practical assembly that didn't announce itself. She removed her hospital badge and put it in her locker. She checked the forearm bandage one more time. Petra was waiting in the corridor outside the locker room. "You're leaving," Petra said. Not a question. "For a few hours." Petra looked at her. The full, direct look she had, the one that didn't leave room. "Is this related to the federal thing?" "I can't discuss it." "Nora," Petra's voice shifted, lost some of its charge nurse efficiency, and became briefly something more basic. "You've been awake for over 12 hours. You have a laceration on your arm that you refuse to suture. You disarmed 2 men last night, and you're standing here looking like you're about to walk into something that has nothing to do with nursing." "It has everything to do with nursing," Nora said. "There's a patient in room 314 who is alive because of what happened last night. I'm going to make sure it stays that way." Petra held her gaze for a moment. Then she stepped aside. "The day crew has Bay 7, she said. "I'll make sure the tactical detail rotates at 1400. "Thank you, Petra." She walked to the elevator. Quote, "The Mill Point facility at noon was quiet in the way industrial zones went quiet in winter. Not empty, but reduced, a skeleton of its weekday operation. 2 loading dock workers eating lunch in a truck cab on the south side. A forklift running somewhere in the interior. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees and the wind coming off the flats was direct and purposeful. Nora arrived 20 minutes early. She found Rourke's tactical team in position before she could see them, which was how it was supposed to be, which meant they were good. She clocked the sniper on the railroad berm through the movement of a crow that lifted from a specific section of rusted track for no visible reason. She identified 2 ground-level positions by the angles of sight that existed around the loading dock's blind spots. She didn't acknowledge any of it. She walked to the position she'd specified, the concrete apron in front of loading bay 3, open on 3 sides, covered overhead, and stood with her hands in her jacket pockets and waited. Hask arrived in a dark gray SUV with a Montana plate. He was alone in the vehicle. She noted that and filed it in the skeptical part of her mind. Either he genuinely came alone, which would be a significant miscalculation for a man of his experience, or his backup was already in position and had arrived before her despite the time she'd taken to get here early. She cataloged him as he crossed the concrete apron toward her. The photograph hadn't entirely captured the quality of his movement, more fluid than she'd expected for his age, the kind of conditioning that required consistent maintenance. He was wearing a heavy coat, hands visible, nothing in them. His face was composed in an expression of professional warmth that she'd seen on intelligence officers before, the particular warmth that meant nothing and was deployed deliberately. "Ms. Voss," he said. "You came alone," she said. "I told you I would." He stopped 8 feet from her. A conversational distance, not a threat distance, deliberately chosen. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet. You said you could offer clarity." She held her position. Let him carry the opening. "Start with that." He studied her for a moment. Whatever he was looking for, he was patient about finding it. "You're calmer than I expected. I've had a long night." "You have?" He nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something. "The men at the hospital, saw the ones you detained. Did the federal team tell you who sent them?" "They're still investigating." "They told you it was me," he said. "Not accusing me, stating, testing. They've built a narrative, and I'm the architect of it. I want you to hear something different before you commit to that version." She waited. "The Kessler Syndicate has been operating in Montana for 6 years, he said. Longer than the federal investigation. The case Teller is involved in, the documentation he's carrying, is real. The murders are real. I've been working to dismantle that organization from the outside, using methods that don't fit within official channels because official channels have been compromised from the inside." He paused. "The federal team you've been speaking with, there are people in that network who are not working toward justice. They're working toward containment, specifically containing the exposure of certain intelligence failures that implicate senior people. Teller's testimony would do that, which is why there are people within the federal structure who want him silent and who have been using me as the face of that effort." It was a good construction. She'd give him that. It had the right shape, truth borrowed from the actual situation, reframed with him as a victim of the same forces he was actually operating. A man of his background knew how to build a mirror. Who specifically, she said. In the federal team. Veda Marsh, he said. She's been running interference on the internal investigation for 14 months. Everything that's been attributed to me, the witness locations, the access to protection arrangements, that trail was built by Marsh's people and pointed at me. Nora let a beat pass. That's a significant claim, she said. I have documentation. He reached into his coat, slowly, visibly deliberate, giving her every chance to see the motion wasn't a threat, and produced a folded document. He held it out. She didn't take it. Set it on the ground, she said. A flicker of something, not quite surprise, recalibration, crossed his face. He set it on the concrete. You're not frightened, he said. You were never frightened. You didn't call Whitfield because you were confused about what you'd walked into. He straightened up. His expression had shed the warmth, not hostile but more honest, assessing her with something closer to professional respect. Who are you actually working with? I told you, I'm a nurse. You were a combat medic. 7th Special Operations Support Command, forward attached to a special operations element in your second deployment. He said it easily, from memory, which meant he'd pulled her file in the window between Whitfield's report and this meeting. You left at 27. You've been in Callaway for 11 months. You have no documented contact with any federal agency. He paused. And yet you disarmed 2 armed men in a darkened corridor last night, and you're standing in front of me right now with the body language of someone who knows exactly where the exits are. She held his gaze. People contain multitudes. They do. He almost smiled. It didn't reach past the surface. What I can't determine is whether you're the bait or the trap. Maybe I'm just the nurse, she said. Maybe. He glanced around, not nervously, but with the systematic attention of a man who had spent a career in environments where checking your perimeter was reflex. His eyes moved to the railroad berm, held there for a fraction of a second. He'd made the sniper. Or he'd guessed the position accurately enough that it amounted to the same thing. Here's what I think, he said, returning to her. I think you're working with Galt. I think the federal team has positioned this meeting, and I think they're expecting me to either confess to something in this conversation or make a move that justifies arrest. He tilted his head. What I'm wondering is whether you actually believe what they've told you, or whether you're just executing a role. She didn't answer that. Instead, the 4 informants, before Teller, their locations were sold. They're dead. Yes. You're saying Marsh sold them. I'm saying the trail leads to people inside that network. I've been building a case for 2 years. He reached into his coat again, same slow deliberateness, and this time produced a small drive. Everything I have is on this. Transmission logs, access records, financial transfers. It will take your team 6 hours to verify, and when they do, you'll understand why going through official channels has been impossible. He held it out. She looked at it, at him, at the distance between them. Set it with the document, she said. He did. Step back, she said. He stepped back. She picked up both items without taking her eyes fully off him and put them in her jacket pocket. And then she said, Roland Hask, you're under arrest. He didn't move. He didn't reach for anything. He stood very still with his hands at his sides and looked at her with an expression that was not panic, not rage, but something quieter and in some ways more disturbing. The expression of a man absorbing a result he had considered as a possibility and was now processing in real time. On what authority? He said. Federal warrant. Issued this morning. She held his gaze. Signed by a judge in Helena. The warrant was filed through a sealed channel that bypasses the standard federal communication network. Which means if you were counting on advance notice, you didn't get it. Galt's voice came through the earpiece she'd been wearing under her collar since she left the hospital. Team's moving. Hask heard something. A change in ambient sound. The low shift of multiple bodies repositioning on the railroad berm and around the loading dock perimeter. He turned his head slightly, tracking it, and in that turn Nora saw the precise moment when the calculation changed for him. When the framing he'd arrived with collapsed into the actual shape of the situation. 4 tactical operators came around the south corner of the building, 2 more from the north. Rourke himself came through the loading bay entrance with 2 additional agents, all moving with the controlled, unhurried speed of a team that had been in position long enough to be entirely certain of their choreography. Hask looked at all of it. Then he looked back at Nora. "The drive," he said, "and the document. Those are real. I want that on record." "Everything you've said in this conversation has been recorded," she said. "Including that." Rourke reached him. Standard arrest procedure. Efficient, professional, nothing dramatic. Hask didn't resist. He put his hands behind his back and looked at Nora over Rourke's shoulder as the cuffs were applied. And what was in his face now was harder to read than anything that had come before it. Not defeat exactly, not yet, but the compressed, calculating stillness of a man who was already beginning to work out what came next. "The drive," he said again. "Verify it." "We will," Nora said. They walked him to a vehicle she hadn't seen arrive. It had come in from the far end of the property, outside the sightlines from the main approach, which told her Rourke had done this well. She stood on the concrete apron and watched until the vehicle was through the gate and gone. Then she let out a breath that had been waiting for longer than she realized. The 6 hours that followed were the organized chaos that came after any major operation where the field work had gone as planned and the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. Rourke's team transported Hask to the Helena field office. The warrant was unsealed and became official record. 2 simultaneous raids, one in Billings, one outside of Missoula, hit locations connected to the Kessler Syndicate's upper tier, and by 4 p.m., 3 senior figures in that organization were in federal custody, with more expected before morning. Nora was back at the hospital by 2 o'clock. She didn't go straight to the debrief room where Marsh was waiting. She went to Teller's room first, checked his chart, checked the dressing, checked his vitals, and confirmed with the surgical resident that the early markers were all clean. He was awake, less sedated than that morning, and he looked at her when she came in with the particular attention of someone who understood more about her role in the day's events than she'd told him. "Is it done?" he asked. "The arrest was made," she said. "The rest takes time." "The documentation, in the storage unit." "Secured," she said. "Galt's team retrieved it this morning, before the operation. It's in an independent evidence chain." She paused. "You'll need to confirm it with your legal counsel before you discuss the details. But it's safe." He closed his eyes. Not in relief. It wasn't quite that clean, but in the particular way a person closes their eyes when something they've been bracing against for weeks stops pressing on them for just a moment. "Thank you," he said. "I'm your nurse," she said. "Get some rest." She went to the debrief. Marsh ran the debrief with the efficiency of someone who had a great deal to process and a finite amount of time. The arrest, the recording, the drive, and document Hask had provided. This last item was being processed by a technical team and had already produced, within the first 2 hours of analysis, a set of access logs that pointed toward a secondary figure in the intelligence leak. Not Whitfield, not Marsh, but a mid-level analyst in the Federal Protection Program's administrative office, whose name Nora didn't recognize but whose fingerprints, apparently, were on 4 of the 6 compromised protection arrangements that had led to informant deaths. Marsh laid this out without particular drama, which Nora had come to understand was simply her register. The drama was in the content, not the delivery. "The analyst's name is Fordham," Marsh said. "He was arrested at 4:15. He's cooperating." She looked at Nora across the conference table. The drive Hask provided was real. The content implicates Fordham directly, and Hask tangentially. He was careful enough not to put himself in the primary record, but what's there is sufficient for federal charges on wire fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to the deaths of the 4 prior informants. She paused. "It's not everything, but it's enough." "He gave you the drive to create reasonable doubt," Nora said. "He's planning to argue he was working against the conspiracy, not inside it." "He is," Marsh said. "It won't work. What he said in the conversation with you, the recorded conversation, makes his knowledge of the operational details too specific for a bystander position. His counsel will try. They'll fail." She held Nora's gaze. "You did well today. It was stated without warmth. That was fine. Nora didn't need it to be warm." "Strand," she said. What's happening with him? Marsh glanced at Burris, who had been quiet for most of the debrief. He was formally arrested at 2 p.m., Burris said. He's waived counsel for the initial interview, which suggests he intends to cooperate fully. His daughter has been moved to a federal safe house in Bozeman. She's safe. He paused. He's been talking for 4 hours. Everything he knows about his contact with Hask's network, dates, methods, specific information he provided, he's giving all of it. Nora thought about Strand's face again. The apology in the corridor, the weight she'd seen in him and misread. He was coerced, she said. He was, Burris said. That'll be a factor in sentencing. It won't excuse the outcome. He met her eyes. You understand that? Yes, she said. I do. There was no version of this where Strand came out clean. A man had been nearly killed because of information Strand had provided. That the fear driving it had been genuine, that the love for his daughter at the center of it had been genuine, didn't change the weight on the other side of the scale. She understood that. She'd seen enough situations where the human reason for a catastrophic choice was completely comprehensible and completely insufficient. The debrief ran another 40 minutes. By the time it ended, the light through the conference room windows had gone from flat afternoon gray to the deeper gray of early evening, and Nora was running on somewhere between 20 and 30 hours without sleep. Galt walked her to the parking lot. They stood outside for a moment in the cold. The particular cold of a Montana February evening that had no interest in your feelings about it. And Nora turned her face into the wind briefly, which was something she'd always done, a habit she'd never analyzed. The drive, she said. Hask's documentation. You'll verify all of it. Already in process, Galt said. We'll know within 24 hours what's legitimate and what was constructed to support his defense narrative. Some of it will be legitimate, she said. He's been in this long enough to have collected real material. That's how he's survived this long. I know. She looked at the parking lot, the hospital entrance beyond it, the lights in the ER bay that had been on all night and all day and would be on tomorrow and the day after. The performance review, she said. Strand pulled it before he was arrested, but there's still the matter of my contract. Galt looked at her sideways. I suspect the hospital administration has updated its thinking on that. Maybe. Or maybe Gerald Foss decides that someone who was involved in a federal criminal operation is a liability and finds a different reason. She paused. I'm not counting on anything. You never do, he said. Not critically, just observationally. She had parked on the east side of the lot. She walked there, and Galt walked with her, and they didn't talk for most of it. A comfortable silence of the type that only existed between people who had spent enough time in genuinely difficult situations together to not need to fill the space. At her car, she stopped. Whitfield, she said. Detained this afternoon. He's in the Helena field office with Hask. Galt put his hands in his pockets. He'll cooperate. He was peripheral enough that cooperation is his best option. He was frightened, she said. Hask had something on him. I could hear it in those 5 words. He'd been waiting for a way out. That may be. It doesn't change what he did. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She got in the car, sat for a moment with the engine off. Galt knocked on the window. She lowered it. Get some sleep, he said. I have a shift at 7. He looked at her. I'm aware of how that sounds, she said. You're aware of a lot of things. She started the engine. Boop. She slept for 4 hours. She didn't dream, or she dreamed and didn't remember, which was the same thing functionally, and she had long ago stopped trying to distinguish between them. She woke at 6, made coffee she actually drank this time, showered, changed the forearm bandage, and drove to the hospital in the particular quiet of a February morning when the city was still deciding whether to fully commit to the day. The ER was in transition when she arrived, night crew finishing, day crew arriving, the institutional churn that always felt slightly discordant at handoff. Too many people in too small a space with too much to communicate and not enough time. Petra was at the desk. She had the look of someone who had slept precisely as much as the situation had allowed. Tell her had a good night, she said when she saw Nora. Vitals stable, surgical resident checked in at 4. Good. Nora clipped her badge to her scrubs. Hospital administrator wants to schedule a meeting. Tell him 10 o'clock. He wanted 7:30. Tell him 10, she said. Petra almost smiled. Also, there are 2 people from the board in the 3rd floor conference room who arrived at 6 a.m., which is unusual. I'll deal with that after rounds. Nora. Petra stopped her with a hand briefly on her arm, the first time she'd done that in 11 months. The night crew, before they left. They wanted me to... She stopped, reconfigured. They wanted you to know what you did. The whole department knows. She let go of Nora's arm. I thought you should hear it from someone who wasn't going to make it awkward. Nora looked at her. Thank you, Petra, she said. She went to do rounds. The meeting with Gerald Foss and the 2 board members happened at 10:15 because Foss pushed back on 10 and Nora let him have the 15 minutes as a concession. The conference room had decent light and worse coffee and a view of the parking lot where, 12 hours ago, a federal vehicle had transported Roland Hask out of her life. Foss was a man who had spent his administrative career managing situations from a position of institutional authority, and the past 24 hours had significantly eroded his comfort with that position. He sat across from Nora with the 2 board members, a woman in her 60s named Dorset, who had the look of someone who had built things and knew the cost of it, and a man named Price who mostly watched and said little, and delivered a prepared statement about the hospital's commitment to staff safety and its appreciation for the role Nora had played in protecting the department. It was the kind of statement that had been drafted by someone who understood liability. She let him finish. The performance review, she said. Foss shifted. Dr. Strand's review has been formally withdrawn from your file. The HR documentation will reflect... I'm not concerned with the documentation, she said. I'm concerned with the pattern that produced it. I was systematically undermined for 11 months by a physician whose judgment was compromised, whose judgment, as of yesterday, we now know was compromised by external criminal pressure. I flagged clinical concerns that were dismissed. I was publicly humiliated in front of patients and staff, and I was days from being forced out of a department where I had performed consistently and correctly. She looked at Dorset, not Foss. I want that on the official record, not the liability-managed version, the actual version. Dorset held her gaze. There was something in her face that wasn't quite respect, more like recognition. What would you need to see from the board to feel that the record reflects accurately? A formal review of every disciplinary action Dr. Strand initiated against nursing staff in the past 3 years. Any patterns consistent with what I experienced should be documented and addressed. That's a significant undertaking, Price said, his first words. Yes, Nora said. It is. Dorset and Price exchanged a look. We can authorize that review, Dorset said. It'll take 60 days to complete properly. That's acceptable, Nora said. Foss had been quiet for most of this. He cleared his throat. There's also the matter of your role going forward. Given the events of the past 24 hours, your background, your demonstrated capability, the board has discussed the possibility of a new position. Nora looked at him. Director of Emergency Security and Crisis Response, he said. It's a new role. We'd be building it around what we've learned these past 24 hours about what this department actually needs. He paused. It's a significant salary adjustment, and it would come with full authority over emergency protocol development. She was quiet for a moment. I'll need the position to carry clinical hours, she said. I'm not leaving the floor. Foss blinked. That would be non-negotiable, she said. Dorset was almost smiling. We can work with that, she said. But the afternoon brought its own sequence of events, each carrying its particular weight. The Kessler Syndicate's leadership, 3 senior figures arrested in the morning raids, 2 more taken into custody in Great Falls by 6 p.m., had begun the process of legal representation and arraignment. The federal case was moving. Teller's documentation, verified by independent forensic accounting, provided the connective tissue the prosecution needed. His testimony, when it came, would close what the documents left open. Strand's formal cooperation agreement was filed in Helena at 3 p.m. The specific charges, unauthorized disclosure of protected patient information, conspiracy, carried potential sentences that his cooperation would reduce but not eliminate. The process of that reduction would take months, possibly longer. Hask's arraignment was scheduled for the following morning. The charges were federal and multiple: conspiracy, wire fraud, accessory to murder for the 4 prior informant deaths, and the evidence against him, including the recording from the Mill Point meeting, was substantial enough that his legal team had reportedly already begun discussing cooperation as the least bad option. He would spend time in federal prison. The question was how much. The answer, Burris told Nora in a brief call that afternoon, was going to be a significant amount. Whitfield's situation was still being processed. He would cooperate. He would receive something less than Hask, something more than a caution. It wasn't tidy, but the law rarely was. Nora processed all of this in the background of her shift, the way she'd always processed parallel information, storing it, turning it over in the margins, letting the main part of her attention stay on the work in front of her. At 5 p.m., she was charting at the triage desk when she heard a sound she recognized. The particular cadence of feet moving down a corridor in a way that wasn't casual, wasn't emergency, but was deliberate and directed. She looked up. Dr. Osei, the surgical resident who'd managed Teller's case through the night, was at the corridor entrance to the ER with 3 other residents behind her, and behind them, 2 of the day nurses, and Petra, and 4 members of the overnight crew who had apparently come back in on their off hours. They stopped when they saw Nora looking at them. Osei said, "We just wanted to—" She stopped, visibly reconsidered, tried again. "The night crew told us what happened, in the imaging wing, and with the federal operation, and—" She stopped again. Nora waited. "We just wanted you to know," Osei said. "All of us." It was not eloquent. It was not a ceremony. It was a group of people standing in a hospital corridor in the middle of a shift, in the particular awkward sincerity of people who meant something and weren't entirely sure how to say it. Nora looked at all of them. "Rounds," she said. "Bay 7 needs a check. Who's got it?" Osei blinked, raised her hand. "Go," Nora said, and then quieter. "Thank you." They went. She went back to her chart. She was 3 lines into the documentation when her phone buzzed. Galt. She stepped away from the desk. "One thing," he said when she answered. "What?" "Hask asked to speak with you, through his counsel, before the arraignment." A pause. "You don't have to. You're under no obligation." "What does he want to say?" "His counsel says he wants to clarify something about the drive, the documents he provided." Another pause. "He says there's one piece of it the technical team won't find because it's not digital and not in the drive. He says he'll only tell you what it is." She stood in the corridor with the hospital humming around her. "He's positioning," she said. "He's building a channel to the investigation through me because he thinks I'll advocate for the significance of whatever he gives me." "That's my read too," Galt said, "which is why I said you don't have to." "But the information might be real." "It might be." She looked down the corridor, Teller's room at the end, Petra at the desk, Osei's white coat disappearing around a corner, the whole complicated machinery of a place that kept people alive. "Set it up," she said. "I'll hear what he has to say." "You sure?" "The last 4 informants are dead," she said. "If there's something he knows that prevents a 5th, I'll sit in a room with him." Galt was quiet for a moment, then, "Tomorrow morning. Helena, I'll drive." "I'll meet you there," she said, and ended the call. She stood for a moment in the corridor. Then she went back to the triage desk, picked up her pen, and finished the chart entry. Clean, specific, the particular precision of a record that would matter to someone she hadn't met yet, a patient not yet arrived, a situation not yet begun. The ER ran around her in its ordinary, extraordinary way, and Nora Voss did what she had always done in every environment that had ever asked it of her. She paid attention, and she stayed, and she was ready for whatever came through the door next. But what came through the Helena facility door the next morning was not what anyone had planned for, because when Rourke's team went to move Hask from holding to the interview room at 7:45, his cell was empty, the door was locked from the inside, and the federal detention officer who had been on his corridor since midnight was unconscious on the floor with a single puncture wound to the neck that looked, To the paramedic who assessed him, exactly like the work of someone who knew precisely where to press to produce the desired outcome without causing permanent damage. Hask was gone. And on the wall of the empty cell, written with something that had once been a pen and was now just a scoring tool, were 6 words that the facility supervisor photographed and sent to Marsh before he fully processed what he was reading. Tell Voss she should have listened. Marsh's text came through at 7:52, and Nora read it standing in the hospital parking lot with her car keys in her hand and the engine running and the February cold doing what it always did, which was make everything feel slightly more urgent than it already was. She read it twice, put the phone in her pocket, stood there for 4 seconds. Then she called Galt. "I know," he said before she spoke. "How long ago?" "Sometime between 2 and 6 a.m. The corridor camera had a 40-minute gap. Someone pulled the feed remotely. Whoever helped him had inside access to the facility's security system." "The internal leak," she said. "Fordham cooperated, but he wasn't the only one." "That's what we're working on right now." She got in the car. "He left a message for me specifically, which means he had time to think, which means the exit was planned before the arraignment. He knew yesterday that the charges were too solid to fight cleanly. We're aware of that timeline." "Warren," she pulled out of the parking lot. "He's not going far, not yet. He said I should have listened. That's not a goodbye message, that's a provocation. He wants me to know he's still in play." A pause. "Nora, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to work." She merged onto the main road. "But you need to look at everyone who had access to that facility's security network in the past 72 hours. Not just Fordham's associates, everyone. And you need to pull the original access log from the Ridgeline Hospital system, not my screenshot, the original, and verify the metadata." "Why the metadata?" "Because Hask is careful. He's been careful for 20 years. If there's any chance the workstation access we attributed to Strand was manufactured, if Hask or someone in his network placed that log entry to point us at Strand while Hask moved, we need to know now." Silence. "That's a significant if," Galt said. "Yes," she said. "It is. Verify it anyway." She drove to the hospital, clocked in, and went to work. She did it because it was the only rational thing to do, because Teller needed wound checks and the ER needed staffing, and the work did not pause for the complications of the life running parallel to it. She did it also because she had learned, over many years in many difficult environments, that the worst thing a person could do while waiting for a situation to resolve was to stop functioning. The waiting that happened inside the work was survivable. The waiting that happened in stillness was not. By 9 a.m., the metadata verification was complete. Galt called. The original access log was legitimate. Strand had accessed Teller's file. The timestamp, the user credentials, the session data, all of it was clean and consistent and definitively Strand's. No manufacturer, no frame. The workstation access was real, the transmission was real, and Strand's cooperation continued to confirm every detail of it, which meant Hask hadn't framed Strand. He'd recruited him, coerced him, and used him, and Strand had made the choice he'd made, and the consequences of that choice were moving through the legal system at their proper speed. And it meant Hask's escape was not about undermining the case against him. The case was solid, regardless of whether he was in a cell or not. The escape was about something else. Nora was charting at the triage desk at 10:40 when she understood what it was. She called Galt again. "He's not running," she said. "He's going after the documentation." "Teller's documentation is in federal evidence." "Not Teller's, his own. The drive he gave me at Mill Point. He said the technical team wouldn't find everything because part of it wasn't digital." She sat forward. "He said there was one more piece. He asked to tell me in person. He was going to use that meeting as a bargaining chip." "We know. That's why I set up the interview." "But the interview didn't happen because he left first. Which means whatever physical documentation he has, wherever it's stored, he needs to get to it before we do. Because if we find it, we find the second layer of his network. The contacts he hasn't exposed yet. The people above Fordham." She paused. "That's why he left the message for me. He's not coming after me. He's telling me he's one step ahead." Galt was quiet. "The Bitterroot Valley property," she said. The last known location before he went mobile. Did your team fully clear it? We did a pass during the arrest operation. A pass, she said. Nora, did they pull the structure, or did they do a visual sweep? The pause was long enough to answer her question. I'll call Rourke, Galt said. Rourke's team reached the Bitterroot Valley property at 12:40 p.m. It was a dry, cold property. Scrub and frozen ground, a main structure and two outbuildings that had been visually cleared during the original operation and then left. The team went through the main structure properly this time, pulling floorboards, checking wall cavities, running a signal detector through the basement. They found it in the second outbuilding, a fireproof lockbox bolted to the underside of a workbench, covered by a removable panel that had been painted to match the surrounding surface, the work of someone who had done this before, who understood that a good hide didn't try to be invisible. It tried to be boring. Inside the box, 17 documents, a second drive, and a handwritten ledger, actual handwriting, ink on paper, the analog choice of a man who understood that paper didn't produce metadata. The ledger took 4 hours to process initially and would take weeks to fully analyze. But within those first 4 hours, 3 things became clear. First, Hask's network was larger than anyone had estimated. The ledger documented financial transfers, access trades, and information sales going back 11 years, predating his official separation from the Defense Intelligence Agency by 4 years, which meant he'd been operating inside the institution while selling from it simultaneously. Second, the ledger identified 2 additional federal employees, neither of whom had been on anyone's radar, who had been providing Hask with access in exchange for payments structured through shell accounts in 3 countries. Third, Hask had documented everything with the precision of a man who intended the ledger to function as mutually assured destruction. Every transaction incriminated him equally as it incriminated his contacts. He hadn't built a blackmail file. He'd built a record so complete that if any part of his network betrayed him, the whole architecture came down together. It was, Burris told Nora that evening, both the most incriminating and the most professionally disciplined evidence package he had encountered in 14 years of federal investigations. Hask was found 36 hours after his escape at a regional airfield outside of Dillon, Montana, 90 miles from the Bitterroot property, moving toward a small private aircraft that had filed a flight plan to Vancouver. He was on foot across the tarmac when 3 vehicles converged from separate approach angles, and a tactical officer on the roof of the terminal building put a laser sight on the space 2 feet in front of him, which was the professional way of communicating that the next step was not recommended. He stopped. He stood on the tarmac in the February cold with his hands slowly rising, and a federal agent later described his expression as the look of a man completing a calculation that had finally run out of variables. He was taken into custody without incident. The second arraignment happened the following morning. This time the charges included escape from federal custody, added to the existing list. His counsel, who had previously been exploring cooperation as an option, found that option significantly narrowed by the ledger, because the ledger made cooperation partially redundant. The evidence it contained was self-documenting in ways that didn't require his testimony to activate. He was remanded without bail. The judge cited flight risk with the particular understatement of someone who felt the phrase earned its keep. Mamatimi. Strand's sentencing happened 6 weeks later in a Helena federal courtroom on a Tuesday morning when the sky outside was doing something complicated with clouds that Nora couldn't name and didn't try to. She wasn't required to attend. She attended anyway, not out of any desire to watch a man be sentenced, but because she believed in being present for the endings of things she'd been part of. It was a habit she'd developed in the military and kept in civilian life, the only ceremonial instinct she'd never entirely shed. He received 3 years in a federal corrections facility and a permanent revocation of his medical license. The coercion was factored in by the judge with visible deliberateness. The sentencing statement acknowledged the threat to his daughter, the genuine fear that had driven his cooperation with Hask, and then acknowledged equally clearly that the cooperation had directly endangered a human life, and that the law did not have a category for understandable choices that produced unacceptable outcomes. 3 years was not the full possible range. It was not nothing. Strand looked smaller in the courtroom than he had in the ER. Not broken, she wouldn't say broken, but reduced in the particular way that happened when a person was finally measured against the full weight of what they'd done and found that the accounting was heavier than they'd lived with. His daughter was not in the courtroom. She was in Bozeman, finishing her semester. That was something. Nora left before the statement was fully processed by the room. The two additional federal employees identified in Hask's ledger were arrested on consecutive days in March. Both cooperated within 48 hours, producing testimony that extended the investigation into two further corners of Hask's network and resulted in 3 more arrests by April. The Kessler Syndicate's leadership, the 3 figures taken in the original raids plus the 2 from Great Falls, were indicted on 41 federal counts collectively, a number that the prosecution estimated would produce sentences averaging 22 years. Marcus Teller testified in a closed federal proceeding in late March, 9 weeks after the night on Route 9, with his shoulder still in a recovery sling and a federal marshal on either side of him. His testimony lasted 2 days. The documentation he'd preserved and that Nora had secured through Galt's independent chain was admitted in its entirety. He called the hospital after the testimony concluded. Petra took the call and transferred it to the ER, where Nora was in the middle of an IV placement, and made the second nurse hold the phone against her ear while she finished. "It held up," he said. "All of it." "Good," she said. "How's the shoulder?" A brief silence, and then something that was almost a laugh. "You're really asking about my shoulder." "You're my patient," she said. "I'm asking about your shoulder." "PT says 8 more weeks before full range," he said. "They say I'm ahead of schedule." "Good," she said again. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Teller." She handed the phone back and went to the next bay. Check. Roland Hask was sentenced in a federal court in Helena on a Thursday in early May, when the mountains had stopped being entirely white and the city was attempting something like spring. The charges were read in sequence: conspiracy, wire fraud, 4 counts of accessory to murder, escape from federal custody, and the judge, a compact woman in her late 60s who had the demeanor of someone who had presided over a great many difficult things and intended to preside over many more, delivered a sentence of 34 years without the possibility of parole before the 25th year. Hask received it standing. He didn't speak. He looked at the room with the same quality of compressed, calculating attention he'd carried at the Mill Point facility, and Nora, watching from the gallery, thought she understood something she hadn't at the time. That the calculation had never really stopped for him. That even here, even in this room, he was working the angles, assessing the variables, looking for the move that hadn't been made yet. There wasn't one. For the first time in 20 years, there wasn't one. The gallery was quiet when the session ended. People filed out in the subdued way of those who had witnessed something with real weight to it. Nora stayed in her seat for a moment, after most of the room had emptied, not processing dramatically, not needing to mark the moment with anything particular, just sitting with it. 4 informants who had died because of the man who had just been led out of this room. Marcus Teller, who had come close. The hollow fact of what systematic betrayal looked like when you laid it out in charges and years. Galt sat down next to her. He'd been 3 rows back. 34 years, he said. Yes, he'll be 83 when he's eligible. I know. They sat for a moment. What Whitfield said in his interview, Galt said, about you. He said, and this is verbatim, that reaching out to you was the first right thing he'd done in 2 years. That something about seeing your name come through made him think there was still a version of this that ended correctly. He paused. I thought you should know that. She considered it. He still has to face what he did, she said. He does. He will. A pause. The right thing and the clean thing aren't always the same thing. No, she said. They're not. She stood, smoothed her jacket. They walked out together into the May afternoon, which was genuinely warm for the first time in months, the kind of warmth that felt like something the earth had been withholding and had finally decided to release. The director position at Ridgeline General became official on the 1st of June. The paperwork finalized, the title added to her badge, the salary adjusted. The board's review of Strand's disciplinary history produced findings that validated what Nora had described, and 3 others from nursing staff had described separately. A pattern of systematic undermining that had gone unreported for years because reporting it meant being dismissed in exactly the way Strand had dismissed Nora, and most people couldn't afford to find out which way it would go. 3 nurses received formal acknowledgement of complaints that had been buried. 2 received back pay adjustments tied to performance evaluations that the review found had been improperly downgraded. It wasn't a complete accounting, it never was, but it was an accounting, and it was documented, and it existed now as permanent record rather than the kind of institutional memory that evaporated when the people who held it moved on. Petra was offered a senior charge nurse designation that came with a pay increase and a formal advisory role in the new emergency security framework. She accepted it with the particular directness she brought to everything, and then immediately used the advisory role to flag 3 protocol gaps she'd been flagging informally for 8 years. Nora put them in the first revision of the Crisis Response Manual. On a Tuesday in late June, warm enough now that the hospital's windows were cracked, and the ER smelled like actual outside air for the first time in months, Nora was walking through the department at the start of her shift when a first-year resident named Baez stopped her near the trauma bays. He was young, earnest, still carrying the particular anxiety of someone who hadn't yet made enough mistakes to know which ones were survivable. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Walk with me," she said. He fell into step. "Were you really in the Army?" She'd been asked this 6 times in the past 4 months. By nurses, by residents, by 2 paramedics who'd heard the story third hand and wanted confirmation. She'd developed no particular formula for answering it. 7 years, she said. Combat? 2 deployments. He was quiet for a beat, working up to whatever the actual question was. "The men who came through the ER in February," he said, "you weren't scared." "I was scared," she said. "I just had something to do while I was scared." He looked at her. Is that something you can learn?" She stopped walking, looked at him properly. He was maybe 26, fresh out of residency training, trying to understand how people became the kind of person who functioned correctly when everything went wrong. She recognized the question because she'd asked it herself once, in a different form. "You learn it by doing the work," she said. "Not the crisis work, the regular work. The everyday work that no one is watching and no one is applauding, and that matters just as much as the dramatic version." She held his gaze. "You get steady by being steady. Every shift, every patient, every decision you make when nothing is on fire." She paused. "The crisis just finds out who you already are." He thought about that. "Okay," he said, with the slightly dazed look of someone receiving information they needed but hadn't expected. "Okay." She went back to walking. The ER moved around her. The intake desk, the curtained bays, the supply stations, and the trauma rooms, and the particular human traffic of a place that existed specifically to absorb the worst moments of the people who came through its doors. She had worked in this department for just over a year now, most of it spent being told in 100 small ways that she was insufficient, her judgment suspect, her presence provisional. She had also, in the past 5 months, held a man's life together with her hands in a darkened corridor, kept a federal witness alive, helped dismantle a 20-year conspiracy, and stood in a courtroom and watched the architecture of that conspiracy come down publicly and permanently and on record. None of that had made her a different person. That was the thing she'd kept trying to explain to people who asked, and kept failing to articulate in a way that landed correctly. She hadn't revealed a hidden version of herself in February. She'd just stopped hiding the version that had always been there because everyone around her had found it inconvenient. She thought about the women who'd sat in break rooms for years and swallowed the version of themselves that knew more, saw more, could do more, because the institution they were part of had made very clear that the acceptable version was smaller. She thought about all the times a person says, "I understand, doctor," when what they mean is, "You're wrong, and I know it, and I'm going to do this correctly when you're not looking." She thought about the particular exhaustion of being competent in an environment that won't credit you for it, and how long a person can carry that before something has to give. She didn't think institutions changed because one person did something dramatic. She'd been in enough institutions to know that wasn't how it worked. But she thought the record mattered. She thought the documentation mattered. She thought the 3 nurses who'd had their complaints formally acknowledged and the 2 who'd gotten their pay corrected. She thought those things mattered in a way that didn't announce itself loudly but accumulated, year over year, into something that eventually became slightly harder to ignore. She wasn't naive about any of it. She never had been. But she was still here. That was the part she kept returning to. She was still here, badge clipped to her scrubs, walking her floor, doing the work that had always been the work. At 3 in the afternoon, a woman came through the ER entrance holding a child, 18 months, maybe 2 years, breathing in a way that Nora clocked from 30 feet as stridor, the high partial obstruction sound, something in the airway that needed immediate attention. She moved toward them before the intake desk had processed the arrival, already calling for a pediatric tray, already talking to the mother in the level, deliberate voice that communicated, "We have this. Stay with me. I need you present." The child was assessed, stabilized, treated, and transferred to pediatric for observation within 40 minutes. The foreign body, a small toy piece, exactly the wrong size and shape, was removed cleanly. The child was crying, which was the correct sound for a child who had just been through something frightening and was now breathing without obstruction. The mother was crying too, silently, in the particular way of someone who had held it together through the crisis and was only now releasing it. Nora sat with her for 3 minutes, not because the protocol required it, because the woman needed someone to sit with her for 3 minutes, and Nora was there, and that was what nurses did. What they had always done, in every difficult room, in every difficult hour, long before anyone was watching and long after everyone stopped. "She's okay," Nora said. The woman nodded, not trusting her voice. "You did the right thing," Nora said, "coming in fast. That was the right call." "I didn't know," the woman said. "I didn't know if I was overreacting." "You weren't," Nora said. "You knew something was wrong and you moved. That's not overreacting. That's exactly right." The woman looked at her. Nora stood, squeezed her hand once, and went back to the floor. There were 3 more hours in the shift. There was work to do. There would always be work to do, in the particular endless way of a place built to absorb what the world produced, the accidents and the illnesses and the bad luck, and the moments when a body suddenly, without permission, became the most urgent thing in a person's life. She had spent 7 years learning to keep people alive in conditions that had nothing in common with a hospital. She had spent the years after learning to keep people alive in conditions that did. The 2 things were not as different as people assumed. The work was the work. The steadiness was the steadiness. The only thing that changed was the terrain. She had been dismissed, and she had stayed. She had been pushed out, and she had stayed. She had been told, in 100 different ways and voices, that the version of herself she was walking around in was not the right version for this particular room. She had stayed anyway. Not because she was trying to prove something, not because she was waiting for the moment when everyone would finally see her correctly. She had stayed because the work mattered and she was good at it, and because somewhere in the 7 years she'd spent keeping people alive in places that wanted to kill them, she had learned that the most radical thing a person could do in any environment that wanted to diminish them was to remain entirely, uncompromisingly themselves. That was all she had ever done. It had been enough. It was enough.